Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. The NSHS brown bags have been offered since the mid-1980s. With a couple of exceptions some years ago, the brown bag topics for a year are not thematic. However, in light of the Nebraska's 150 celebration of statehood, the Society will sponsor brown bags for 2017 related to the theme, Peoples of Nebraska. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at 15th and P Street in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience, are taped by City TV 5, are broadcast on government access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, and Beatrice, and are posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at www.nebraskahistory.org. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership in the Society include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine and the Society's newsletter, use of a microfilm reader printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, discounts in the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock, and reduced fees for kids' classes, tours, after-hours events, and similar activities for there is a fee. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. To find these videos on YouTube, directions for our live audience are on today's handout. For those viewing the video, the directions are on the screen. Type in your browser www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical/. If you click on playlists, you will go to a new page, and there, the first thing you should see on your left will be labeled 2017. That'll be a subsection to house all of these brown bags for this year. Right next to that, you'll see a subsection called Brown Bag Lectures, which is the other 150 that are online. Our speakers today are Shane Tucker, highway paleontologist, works at University of Nebraska State Museum, and Rob Bozell, archaeologist, and he's with the State Historical Society. Shane is a native of York, Nebraska, received a BS and MS in geology from the University of Nebraska. Since 2000, he has worked for the Nebraska Highway Paleontology Program, a cooperative effort between the University of Nebraska State Museum and the Nebraska Department of Roads. He travels throughout the state collecting fossils threatened by highway construction. His research interests include Nebraska geology and mammalian paleontology, particularly microfossils. Some highlights from his career include working at ashfall fossil beds and excavating a 70 million year old long-necked plesiosaur. Rob is an associate director with the State Historical Society, and he manages the archaeology division. He received BA and MA degrees in anthropology from NU and has been actively involved in archaeological research and cultural resource management in Nebraska and surrounding states for over 35 years. His professional and research interests have focused on the central and northern Great Plains and include Native American archaeology, subsistence and environmental change, fur trade archaeology, repatriation, and tribal consultation. He has authored numerous technical reports, journal articles, and book chapters on these subjects. Their topic is Nebraska fossils and people before written history. Just to let you know about asking questions, they prefer you wait until the end to ask. Please join me in welcoming Shane and Rob.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about the Nebraska fossil segment of the talk. As John said, I work for the Highway Paleontology program, and I go out and monitor active highway construction projects for fossils. So we're following around these big pieces of heavy equipment, looking for any fragments that they may churn up, and then excavating them, removing them from the ground, bringing them back to the museum to study. And a lot of what we find on these projects contribute significantly to our knowledge about Nebraska's past. We don't stop highway construction, we work alongside them. And in some instances, it may just be a scrap, like you see the little white chunk beneath my knee there on the surface, that will turn into a complete skull and lower jaw from an Ice Age bison, or including the skeleton to that. So that was one that we collected in 2015 from a highway project near Arnold, Nebraska. And so what I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the Pleistocene and some of the animals that were there during the Pleistocene. Nebraska has a long, varied past. We have rocks at the surface from 290 million years ago, just a little bit east of here, that shows we were at the equator with an ocean over the top of us. We have rocks from the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs were around, from 100 to 70 million years ago, when we were once again covered by oceans. And the majority of what Nebraska is known for is the last 38 million years of mammal evolution, and documenting the evolutionary history of horses, camels, carnivores, and how our climate has changed and how that's impacted the habitat. So we'll start with the Ice Age. We could talk about each of these for 20 minutes, but we're just going to focus on the Ice Age today. Here's a map showing paleogeography of the continents from the last glacial maximum around 24,000 years ago. And you can see in the picture there that the majority of the northern hemisphere at the higher latitudes are covered with large, thick sheets of ice, as well as Antarctica, as well as a shelf around Antarctica. And so much cooler times, as these glaciers, especially in the northern hemisphere, advanced and retreated, it would either suck water out of the ocean basins, or if they were melting, put water back into it. If it sucked the water out of the ocean basins, it would create more land surface, so animals could migrate between continents. And it would also displace habitats as these things would advance. So as the habitats were displaced, they would come further south, and we'd see more northern taxa. So the Ice Age, as most people would think, would be cold all the time, but it wasn't really that way. It was fluctuations. We had warm intervals in between glacial episodes, and in those warm episodes, we found animals that had more of a southern aspect, or were typically found in warmer climates, come in. And as the glaciers advanced and came over Nebraska, the animals that lived in the northern environment started to come down, and we see cold-adapted animals here. And so we're going to look at those. At any particular time, like you see there on the little chart, the last glacial maximum, right, a little slightly younger than 20,000 years ago, you had a drop of maybe 450 feet in sea level. And so that's quite the difference. So it wasn't completely cold all of the time. We had warm intervals and we had cold intervals. Nebraska was covered by glaciers in their past. So the light blue on the screen there is the extent of glaciers. Basically, we had several advances between maybe 1.8 million years ago, and then the last glacial advance about 25,000 years ago. And a lot of these, we don't know how many times this ice sheet advanced and covered up the state, because as a new one comes in, it grinds away the one that was there previously. So we're not exactly sure how many times the ice advanced over the across our state. But at some point in time, it extended all the way down into Kansas. We have evidence here in Lincoln with the really clay-rich soils, as well as the rocks that aren't characteristic of the area. So if you go to Belmont School, you'll see a big, huge chunk of Sioux quartzite that would have come in from Minnesota or South Dakota that was hauled in, and then when the ice melted, it just dumps everything there. So if you go drive towards Valparaiso and look in the fields, you'll see these big chunks of rock that are not native to the state as remnants of these advances. The darker blue on the screen, which is at the North Dakota-South Dakota border, or is the Nebraska and South Dakota border, was the last furthest advance at the last glacial maximum 25,000 years ago. So the habitats that we had during the Ice Age, we had vast prairies, lots of open grasslands. Here's a picture of the sandhills today. It would have looked very similar in the Ice Age. We also have habitats that were shifted when the glaciers advanced from the north. These boreal forests that had black spruce, white spruce, fir. A lot of these evergreens, they were very poorly drained, so water was very slow moving in these streams. A lot of beaver ponds, marshy areas, boggy areas. And in these boggy areas, there's usually grass in between the tree stands. So those were the habitats that these animals were living in. And now we're going to go and look at some of the animals that were here for the remainder of the period of the talk. We had Columbian mammoths. So Columbian mammoths, as you can see there, have very large, long legs, relatively short head, tusks that were between 12 and 14 feet in length, kind of the slope back. Unlike the woolly mammoth that everybody thinks are around in Nebraska, we had very few woolly mammoth. Majority were Columbian mammoths, very light coat. And these would stand maybe 13 feet tall and weigh between 20 and 24,000 pounds. If we look at the distribution of mammoth throughout the state, they're basically everywhere. A couple of reasons for that. The Ice Age deposits are right at the surface, and so they're very close to the surface. In addition to that, mammoths are extremely large. So whether you're building a house or building a road, if you hit a mammoth bone, you're going to notice it. So everybody's going to see those things. And so basically statewide, one other additional thing you can note from the map there is that in many instances we see the mammoths occurring in these major drainages. And that's just because that's where active erosion is occurring. The more active erosion you have, the more chance and likelihood that you're going to uncover fossils. Nebraska is one of the richest states in the country for fossils. So anywhere you dig, there's a high probability that you're going to encounter something. Now we go from mammoth teeth. The one on the screen here is the first baby tooth that a mammoth would have. It's about the size of a dime. It looks very similar to an adult one, just a very miniature version of one. And throughout its adult lifespan, mammoth will get 6 different teeth, and they come in their jaw in kind of a conveyor belt pattern. As one tooth is wearing out, another one is pushing forward and pushing it out of the jaw. And eventually you'll get a tooth like this. And I brought a tooth in that I'll pass around here. This is a tooth from a mammoth. Mammoth were inhabiting these cool, dry grasslands. Their teeth are composed of these enamel plates that are all held together with cement around the outside. Now this is a cast of a tooth from Archie, which is the museum's mascot, if you've ever been to the museum there on campus at Morrill Hall. And on the surface of the tooth here, you can see on the cast, the white, which is the enamel, is a little bit harder than the dentine in here, which is the black. And so it leaves this very ridged surface that the teeth can basically grind these very abrasive grasses on. So I'll pass that around. So there's Archie. You guys have seen Archie before. Archie is not an entire skeleton, it's just a partial skeleton. When Mr. Carriger found Archie in 1920, he found the front limbs, some of the vertebrae and ribs in the middle, the palate and the lower jaw, and just a section of the tusks. So a lot of this has some reconstruction. In order to get an entire mammoth skeleton, it's a composite. So there's some ribs and vertebrae from Custer County mammoth, some from Reynolds, Nebraska for the hind limbs, as well as some from Kansas. So it's not one individual. Here it is mounted in the museum prior to Morrill Hall, and it was mounted such that you could walk through the front legs. The gentleman standing there is E.H. Barbour, who was the first director of the museum, or the one that really brought forth the development of Morrill Hall. And here is Archie as it's being mounted in Morrill Hall in 1933. So quite the undertaking. One other noteworthy mammoth deposit that we have here in Nebraska is the Crawford Mammoths. The Crawford Mammoths are two fully mature males that died interlocked in battle. These were from northwest of Crawford, out there in the Badland regions. And we think that these guys were hormonally jacked up and enraged in a state of muss where they were super aggressive. What also contributed to these is that each of the mammoths had a broken tusk and a complete tusk. So the short tusk was used as a spear. And so when these guys are just full of hormones, trying to battle to get the rights to mate, they're battling each other, and the tusk, one of the short tusks of one of them, goes into the eye socket of the other, killing it. They can't get apart, and then the other mammoth will eventually die next to that one. And you can see the other ones in the background probably thinking, good job, guys. Now I get full range over whoever I want. So these are out on display at Trailside Museum, which is a satellite museum out at Fort Robinson State Park. And it actually documents some of these behaviors that we don't get to see in extinct animals. There it is in the floor. You can see the tusk going into the eye socket of the other, and then the complete skeletons laid out there next to each other. If you guys know Mike Voorhees, who was my mentor at the museum, when he was a student, he got to excavate these. So in addition to ashfall, Mike gets another rare occurrence of fossils. So that's mammoths. In addition to mammoths, we had mastodons. Mastodons were here for 15 million years, but they're really well known during the Ice Age. They look a lot different than the mammoths. They're more stocky. They have a nice shaggy coat. They were probably in small groups, kind of a long head, probably 10 feet in height, weighed 17,000 to 24,000 pounds. And they were adapted to live in these forested regions, these boreal forests and the open areas in between. And here you can see some of the black spruce on the landscape as he's coming out of the forest there. In contrast to the mammoth distribution map, you can see they're much more sparse as far as distribution goes, mostly in the eastern third of the state. But as you go much further east in the United States, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, they're much more common. So we find roughly 10 mammoth teeth for every single mastodon tooth. So very, very uncommon. If we look at the teeth from these mastodons, you can tell just right away there's a different construction to the tooth. They have these lophs with these high cusps on them, and when they intermesh these teeth, these cusps come together and act more of as a shearing and slicing action. And so these mastodons were eating the coniferous twigs in these boreal forests, and I'll pass that around so you guys can have a look. All right, here's one mounted in Morrill Hall. Horse were also very common during the Ice Age. One particular site around 300,000 years ago, there's several hundred individuals from that particular site. Here I'm comparing on the left a lower jaw from a modern day horse with a Ice Age horse, very similar in size. These are both the size of a quarter horse. We also had some horses that were larger, that were draft horse size, and then some that were stilt-legged, more closely related to the wild asses over in Asia. Bison, which is probably, in addition to the mammoths, one of the more common fossils that we do recover. Here is bison latifrons being chased by our Totus, which is a short-faced bear. And if we look into the bison in a little bit more detail, we can see that there were several species that lived during the Ice Age. Bison latifrons is the largest. It's about 8 feet tall, probably weighed between 4,500 and 6,000 pounds. It's about 25 to 50% larger than the modern day bison species on the right there standing next to the man. It was contemporaneous with another species called Bison antiquus, which is what most of us encounter if we're finding fossils. That's the one just to its right. It's about 7 to 7.5 feet tall, probably weighed 3,500 to 5,000 pounds. And even though those two are extremely large, there's not a lot of differences in the proportions of their limb bones. Where there is the difference is in the size of the horns. From tip of the horn to tip of the horn in a bison latifrons, it can be up to 84 inches. The one in the figure is roughly 78 inches. We have Bison antiquus directly above it, so you can see how large and how much wider of a horn span that has than Bison latifrons has than Bison antiquus. That's roughly 36 inches. And as Bison antiquus evolves through time, it gets smaller and smaller as you advance in the Ice Age until it's basically unrecognizable from the modern day species bison. And there's a comparison showing Bison antiquus with the 36-inch horn tip to horn tip wingspan, and then Bison, which is a roughly 24-inch tip to tip. We had 4 different species of Musk Ox that were named. The one in the image there, Ovibos, is more, it's related to the tundra Musk Ox that we see today. So these probably lived really close to the glacial front when the glaciers were advanced. But we also find evidence of woodland Musk Ox that lived in these boreal forests and then the open areas in between that in the picture you can see up top. Between Ovibos, between the roughened patches on the top of the skull, you see a cleft. And in the woodland one, it's just a big mass of horn that's going to go across the top of its skull. These musk ox were, especially Ovibos, was much smaller than a bison. Even though it had the thick, shaggy coat, it probably weighed half, again, what a bison does. So a lot of fluff, very little to it. We had lots of camels. Almost all of the evolutionary history of camels is told in the rocks here in Nebraska. We have small camels from 36 million years ago all the way through some giants that occurred earlier in the Ice Age, and then the one that was around Camelops at the end of the Ice Age at the megafaunal extinction. This was roughly 7 to 7.5 feet tall, probably weighed 1,800 pounds. And in addition to these larger camels, we also had llamas running around the landscape. So we had llamas. Eventually those will migrate down to South America around 3 million years ago. The larger camels will go over to Asia roughly at the same time. We see these stag moose. These are extremely rare in the fossil record. We typically find just chunks of antler to them. These were roughly 8 feet tall, may have weighed 1,500 pounds. Had very long legs. These were adapted for living in those marshy lake bog conditions. Could walk out into the water quite a ways to feed just like a moose would. This is the largest cervid to ever live, and they were around until moose actually come over from Asia and outcompete them. One thing you notice about their antlers is they come out straight from the side of the skull, and then they'll branch into all these different tines, kind of palmate just like a moose would. So kind of a combination between your elk and your moose. Caribou, we had woodland caribou. The one pictured here is one that would be on the open tundra grasslands, but we had ones that lived in those boreal forests that were eating lichens, willows, things like that. And here's an antler from, I believe, Hayes County. And then we get into the Ice Age super predators. And we talked about our Totus a little bit. This is probably the guy you would not want to meet up with if you went back to the Ice Age. This guy stands on all fours, 6 feet, so he could look me directly in the eyes. When he stood up, he could be 12 feet in height, and he could probably reach another couple feet. And with the very long legs, he's probably very fast as well. So he probably was on these open grasslands, basically chasing down anything it wanted to eat. So I would say this is the top predator. Other people think that this big beast is just a scavenger. But due to its size, I think this was a big killer. Here's a skeleton mounted up at the Mammoth site. And I brought a few bones in with me that I put on the table by the door. There's a cast of this skull. This is the best skull we have from Nebraska. They are extremely rare. But this is in the collections at the American Museum of Natural History. So if you want to take a look at that before you leave, I'll stick around and we can visit more about that. And just to show the size difference between the modern bears, you see our Totus upper arm bone, the humerus bone on top, compared with the grizzly down below that. Grizzly bear being roughly 4 feet in height, down to a black bear in size, which is roughly 3 feet in height. So much, much more massive. Our Totus probably weighed around 2,200 pounds. A polar bear weighs maybe 1,300 to 1,700 pounds. So this is a massive, massive animal. We also had American lion. It's 25% larger than the African lion. And so this guy probably stood 4 feet, probably weighed around 900 pounds. These guys are also extremely rare in the fossil record, as carnivores typically are. But if you go out to the La Brea tar pits, which is one of the best Pleistocene sites anywhere in North America, there's hundreds of these that have been preserved and trapped in those tar pits. Everybody loves the saber-toothed cat, and this is one on the left. You can see the reconstruction. It has very long forelimbs. It's very muscular. This would be about 3 feet tall, probably weigh 300, 400 pounds. And the one on the right there is a mounted skeleton. Some think they use those long arms to hold down their prey, and then they would deal the death blow with their extremely large 11-inch canine teeth, and then kind of let the animal hopefully cut a main artery and let the animal die before it would go back in and feed. Now, what we have from Nebraska is pretty sparse, and you're going to laugh at this picture, but this is the back end of the head. So at La Brea, lots of skeletons, complete, nice skulls. Here we don't have very much. And the majority of where we're finding these things, in a lot of instances, are commercial gravel pits. As they mine the gravels for road materials, they're also bringing up these fossils and uncovering those. And if a gravel pit operator is willing to let us into them, we're able to get a vast amount of knowledge about the Ice Age from the bones that we find on the piles. They're waste in the gravel pit. These are just some pieces of bone there. The upper arm bone from the American lion next to Smilodon in the middle. We also had cheetahs roaming in the Ice Age. And then in the warmer portions, the interglacial episodes, we have animals that were more adapted for warmer climates, like gopher tortoises. The one on the left is one from 3 million years ago. These guys are known for their digging abilities, so they can dig tunnels that may be up to 45 feet long, go down maybe 10 feet below the surface, and they use these as places to hide from predators, extreme heat, extreme cold. But if it gets too cold, like the Ice Age was the majority of the time, then they would go extinct in Nebraska, and then when it got warm again, they'd migrate north again. Giant beaver, I have a cast of one of these. This is an animal that's 8 to 10 feet long. These would be in those boggy, marshy areas in the boreal forests. Probably weigh 300 pounds at least, and the skull is a good 12 inches in length. These have big, broad incisors. They probably weren't the engineers that the modern-day beavers were. And in this picture, they figure it with a flattened tail, and we know that's not the case. We've seen tail vertebrae that are more spindle-like. We know they had a rounded tail, much more like a muskrat than the modern-day castor had. And then we also had sloth, these big ground sloths. This is a ground sloth called Paramylodon that would be 6 to 8 feet tall, weigh probably 1,000 pounds. With its big claws on the front feet, you might think it was a meat eater, but they're actually plant eaters. They lack enamel on their tooth surface. They were probably inhabiting open grasslands as well as the open areas in the woodlands. And the one on the right is from La Brea tar pits. If we want to compare it with the other sloth that was living at the same time, Megalonyx, which was an individual that was 5 to 6 feet tall and probably weighed 700 to 900 pounds, Paramylodon's claw is on the left, and Megalonyx is on the right. So you can see the size difference. But if we look at and compare the claw with the largest of the ground sloths that were around in the southern U.S. as well as South America, Rematherium, you can see a huge difference in size. This is an individual that would stand about 12 feet tall, probably weighed 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. and got as far north as maybe South Carolina, Texas, Florida Gulf Coast. So with that, I'm going to end my portion of the presentation and turn it over to Rob.
One question we get a lot is, who lived here prehistorically? People sort of know who was here in 1491. Columbus came and there were Native Americans. But a lot of people don't really know what was sort of before that. Sometimes we hear, were they cavemen? Were they Neanderthals? Who were these people? So that's what I want to talk about is 12,000 years of people living in Nebraska before the written record. And last time I gave a talk on one of these brown bags, it was on some of the weirdest stuff we hear about races of giants and aliens and angels. And they put on YouTube and there was 10,000 negative comments, so they had to take down the comment feature. So I hope this goes better. But there was one thing I forgot at that time was that the people did not ride dinosaurs. So at least in Nebraska, we have no evidence of people riding dinosaurs, including Carl Sagan with a lightsaber there. Okay. So for just a moment, I want to talk, and Shane alluded to, about how do we know all this stuff? Well, in Nebraska, a lot of how we know it is paleontology and archaeological research in response to construction projects. And the Nebraska Department of Roads pays for programs here at the Society and Shane's program, and so a lot of work is done in response to that. This actually happens to be Corps of Engineers project in South Dakota, where what you're looking at there is an Indian village that up, I think, at Lake Oahe, north of Pierre, and the water has already filled up and it's created that huge slump. And so basically that village, which is that circular thing, is eroding into the reservoir. Now, there was archaeology done there before that happened to recover a lot of information. So a lot of archaeology is done that way. A lot of it is also done by the Highway Department. This is some work we did on a project up by Fremont. This is, throughout all this work, there's actually over 10,000 archaeological sites known in Nebraska. Not all of those have been excavated by any means, but each one of those little fuchsia dots is an archaeological site. The other reason that we know a lot about the past before written records is oral tradition. And oral tradition is actually really interesting. Native American people had traditions about where they came from, when they came there, their migration stories. And it's a lot of fun because some of them mesh really well with archaeological stuff and some of them don't at all. And so it's kind of challenging, but I know there's been some oral traditions that we've relied upon that have helped us try to flesh out some of the archaeological information. So we do use that too. There's a guy with the Omaha tribe showing us some ancient rock art up by south of Sioux City. Just to give you a sense of time scale, the little red thing is the period of written record. So even though, as John said, this is a 12-month brown bag series, only the first one is everything before the red. So you got 11 talks on the little red thing and only one talk. So it's no fair, but so anyway. What we know about humans in Nebraska is that we know for sure that people were probably here 12 or 13,000 years ago. They may have been here earlier. I'll talk about that a little bit. That we know based on artifacts that are 12 to 13,000 years old. We know that. There are probably people in North America earlier than that, at least 15,000, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what we know about that and why we think we know it. This is actually, a lot of how we know about that is now DNA. 10 years ago, when you were talking about getting DNA out of ancient skeletons, it was like this sort of theoretical thing that, yeah, maybe someday, sort of like going to Mars. Yeah, someday we can theoretically go to Mars. Now they're doing it, and it's really revolutionized a lot of our profession in terms of understanding the early colonization of North America. And it's in its infancy. There's a lot's going to be happening in the next 10 years about this stuff. And actually, if anybody's interested, there's a nice article in a magazine called American Archaeology that came out a couple of months ago, if you want to read more about DNA studies. But essentially what it looks like is that, and my colleague Phil Guy drew a picture of Nebraska there. You see as people came down, they got to Chadron, and then they either went to Chicago or down to Texas. It looks like but what looks like what we may be knowing is that people probably started coming across the Bering Strait much earlier than we thought. We used to think they came about 12 or 13,000 years. It's earlier. Whether they came to Nebraska, I don't know. We don't have any evidence of that yet. We may, but right now we don't have any firm evidence of that. But we have evidence of sites on the East Coast and the West Coast and South America that are between 13, 14, 15, 16, 17,000 years old. It also looks like some of these people probably came across the Bering, or not, they came across the Bering Strait, but then came down the Pacific coast. And there's some really early sites in South America that people may not have even moved inland. They just kind of stayed along the coast. Now, this is during the Ice Age, like Shane was talking, so there's a lot of the world's water locked up in these giant ice sheets, so the oceans were lower. So there may be coastlines that go way out beyond what we know of today in California and Mexico and Western South America that have a lot of archaeology in them. So this is all really brand new stuff, and really, I think it's pretty exciting. There is a theory out there that I don't, there's not a whole lot of evidence for it, that people may have come from Europe across the Atlantic following Atlantic ice sheets. And that's based on some similarity in the kind of stone tools you get 12, 13, 14, 15,000 years ago on the East Coast. That has not gotten a lot of traction. There may be something to that, but there's no real evidence for it. It's really kind of a theory at this point. The other thing that DNA tells us, which is really interesting, is these people are Indians. They're Native Americans. They're not Europeans. They're not. There was one 13,000-year-old skeleton, a young boy from Montana, who they were able to get DNA out of, and he's mostly closely related to modern Native Americans. We don't know what tribe, but that's what's going on. These are Asiatic people of a distant Asiatic ancestry, came from Northeast Asia and down. What's new is that it's probably earlier than we thought. When I read this article, something I didn't know, and I don't know much about this, but it's kind of interesting, is that some of the South American people seem to have that same genetic imprint with the addition of maybe some Australian and Melanesian and Polynesian blood in them too. So that's new stuff too, that some of these people that might be coming across the Pacific Ocean on boats, and because some of the earliest sites are actually in South America, not North America. So I want to get back to Nebraska and just quickly run through some slides showing what the archaeological record of Nebraska tells us. From 13,000 to, well, first of all, right around 12 or 13,000, when people got here, they encountered some of the animals that Shane was talking about. There were mammoths here. There was giant bison here. There was probably horses and camels. And not necessarily in Nebraska, but in surrounding states, we have sites where these people are actually hunting these animals and butchering them and eating them. Here's an example of that kind of thing. That's probably about a 13,000-year-old site. There's one site, actually a couple of sites, which I think deserve mention, down in southwest Nebraska that are mammoth sites. They're mammoth skeletons that have been broken up, and the archaeologists that have investigated think this can only happen by humans bashing these things and breaking them open. These are 18,000 years old. This is the Lasena mammoth on Medicine Creek Reservoir. Again, there's no stone tools, there's no charcoal, there's nothing to really confirm it, but it is interesting. Some people think that breakage pattern is a product of trampling by other elephants or some kind of natural process. I don't think we know, but it is interesting. So this really early stuff in North America, debate or understanding or kind of evolving research, does involve a couple sites in Nebraska. This is just some of these early 8, 9, 10, 12,000-year-old sites in Nebraska produce these spear points. They're very well made. The one on the far left is a Clovis point. The one next to it's a Folsom point. These are extremely well made technologically. Beautiful specimens. Some of these other ones are a little bit later, but also of that same general time period. And these people were generally pretty nomadic. We don't find villages, what you call villages back then. You find camps, you find kill sites, but they don't seem to be staying in one place for any protracted periods of time. The reason we don't know a whole lot about it is a lot of these sites are really deep. This is an example of a couple of sites down on Medicine Creek Reservoir. You can see these people here at probably 20 feet and 40 feet below the surface. That is maybe the same site or a different site, but those little people down there, those are archaeologists down there. So they're deeply buried sites and not often exposed. So I think we know there's a lot more underneath the ground that we still need to figure out about how these people live. But generally what we know is that they're hunting big game and they're fairly nomadic. They also did some communal hunting, and these create spectacular archaeological sites where they would kill a bunch of buffalo at one time, and sometimes in multiple episodes at the same place, and they create really dramatic archaeological sites. One of which is interpreted, the Hudson Ming site in northwest Nebraska. It's a bison bone bed up north of Fort Robinson. Anybody been there? Okay, if those of you who haven't, you should go. It's really neat. If you're up by Fort Robinson, schedule an extra half a day and run up there. Kind of a neat site. There's a lot of debate about whether these bison maybe died naturally and were scavenged by people or the people killed them. Don't know, but a lot of the bone bed has been left intact. There's been a building built over it, and that's it for interpretive stuff and continual study. It's sort of like Ashfall, but it's an archaeological site. It's owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, yeah, right. Just to show you, and these are a little more recent sites, around, I don't know, maybe 8,000 or 9,000 years ago up to about 2,000. People became a little more settled. They're still not really living in villages, at least in Nebraska, but they seem to be having a little more settled way of life. There's a lot of long-distance trade evidence. It's kind of neat because you start seeing some really cool marine shell artifacts. Some of these objects here are from the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic Coast, the Pacific Coast that were traded in here by people in Nebraska in some kind of long-distance trade network. So it's kind of a more settled way of life, and we start to see more burials, and some of them have fairly rich grave offerings, so we know there has some maybe stratified society. So things are becoming more societal, even as early as before 2,000 years ago. Now, in Nebraska and a lot of places around the country, things really heat up in the last 2,000 years. We know a lot more, partly because things are shallower, but also because I think there's just a lot more sites in the last 2,000 years. And this is when people started building villages and living in a place and staying there for many months or sometimes many, many years at a time. The earliest people, about a couple thousand years ago, start making structures. They maybe have looked like this. They're not teepees. They're probably hide or thatch-covered structures. They're starting to make pottery. Get some really nice pottery vessels. In fact, we've got a couple of vessels upstairs, or maybe one on the second floor that's of this period, probably 1,500 years ago. Here's an example of some of those pots. That pottery also signals that people are doing different stuff with food. They're starting to cook different things, more vegetable things, storing water, storing food. So things are becoming a little more settled. And just so you kind of get a sense, this map sort of shows how many sites that really date to the last 1,000 years to 500 years ago. That's when things really heat up, when you get true villages. And there's probably, this is something that a lot of people don't understand. And I get like the opportunity to talk about this at this session, that when we think of tribes, Omaha, Pawnee, Sioux, Cheyenne, all the tribes we know about who Nebraska was their homeland, a lot of those people are relatively recent immigrants here from different places in North America. But before most of them came, with the possible exception of the Pawnee, there was villages all over. We think some of these may be Pawnee, we're not sure, but there's a lot of archaeology. And a lot of these sites have been excavated, so we know a lot about them. And here's some few slides of the sort of what we get out of these sites. They are now building permanent houses. They're not teepees, they're earth lodges, or at least the precursor of the earth lodge. They're cutting down a bunch of big trees, digging holes in the ground, setting the posts, building a superstructure of wood or thatch and covering it with some kind of earth or daub or adobe or some kind of earthen covered sod later on. And they're living in these things for, a generation sometimes, 10, 20 years. And this is an excavated one on a Department of Roads project. They're all Department of Roads projects. and just so you kind of get oriented, the crew is standing in the middle of this excavated house. The small little holes around what you see as a big square are post holes. That's where the native inhabitants dug a hole in the ground, stuck a post. The post either burned or rotted in place and leaves kind of a dark circular stain. That's how we know where the posts are. The orange patch behind the crew, in front of the crew, is a big central fireplace. And then all these other big holes are storage pits, where they would dig a hole probably to store meat or corn. A lot of times if you have a hole like that, you're going to have problems with water and rodents, so you have to keep digging new, fresh storage pits, and you fill the old ones up with trash. So some of these are literally trash cans, and they're great because we love trash. The more trash, the better. And some of them are just filled, the floors of them are just filled with broken pots and animal bone refuse, broken stone tools. They're really neat. We've dug hundreds of these sites over the last 60, 70 years. So we know a lot about these people. Again, this is still before any contact, even before any written records. Artist reconstruction of a couple, a lot of variation. Some are sort of round, oval, some are nice and square. And these sort of evolved into what we know of as the Earth Lodge a little bit later. Okay, some of the objects. Pottery gets real sophisticated. Lots of decoration. Pottery decoration is great because it can tell us a lot about who made these pots. Again, it's too early to talk about different tribes necessarily, but you can see different groups, different pottery making traditions. You can start kind of tracing that stuff around and talk about how people migrated and came together and split up based on the sort of pottery decoration they have. That item up on the upper right, I think it's a stone. I believe it's a pipe. It's from Nebraska, from Webster County. What's kind of neat about it is it looks like that fellow or woman, I think it's a fellow probably, is wearing some kind of helmet, and he's probably a ball court player. And this is probably a Mississippian object found in Nebraska, maybe traded, but certainly shows some kind of association with Mississippian folks. Okay, some more stone tools. That's kind of neat. That's a knife embedded in a rib handle down there. Those are marine shell carved fish ornaments. Now in eastern Nebraska, we start seeing tribes like the Pawnees and Omahas, Poncas, Otos, really like in the 1700s. That's when you see, and most of those people came from the east. They were being pushed by European groups and other Native American groups from the east, and their homeland, a lot of it was like the Great Lakes area. So they're not truly indigenous to Nebraska, again, with the exception of the Pawnee, who could have been here maybe 1,000 years ago. There's some sites related to those kind of villages. You can see there's not very many, but they're big villages. They're really spectacular. And they look like this. That's actually Fort Clark up in North Dakota, but this is what Omaha and Pawnee and Oto villages probably look like. Big Earth Lodge villages housing thousands of people. This is, anyone ever been to Knife River Indian villages? There wasn't very many people. I could have said it was in Nebraska, but somebody here would have known that it's in North Dakota. This is North Dakota, great picture, and a lot of these villages like this are in Nebraska, but have been cultivated so you don't see it. But each one of those little circles is an Earth Lodge depression. Again, they dig these things in, they collapse, they leave a depression, and that's what some of these Pawnee and Omaha villages look like. These storage pits become chambers, basically. They're giant. This is an archaeologist standing at the base of one. If you can see that sort of shadow over his shoulder, that's actually the edge of the pit. They probably had ladders getting down in here. And like I said, they're used to store corn, bison meat, but filled with trash. This is actually also in South Dakota on a Corps of Engineers or Smithsonian mitigation for one of those reservoir sites that went under in the 50s. Some of them have these big fortification ditches. A lot of warfare going on at this time. The other image is an archaeologist down at the bottom of one of these fortification ditches. Those are all buffalo bones sticking out of there. So there's sometimes 10 or 12 feet of trash at the bottom of these ditches. Some of the pottery, these are Pawnee pots, very distinctive. That kind of decoration tells us it's very distinctively Pawnee versus Omaha or Oto or somebody else. And lastly, trade goods. Starting in the 1700s is when people started getting trade goods with Europeans, and they started writing things down, and that's how we sort of know about that. But the point, kind of to wrap up here, because John's going like this, which means wrap up, is that that people lived here for at least 12 or 13,000 years before the written record. They have a story too. They're people just like us, and that's why we think archaeology and paleontology is really important, because that's the only way to know this stuff. And we feel great gratitude towards people like the Department of Roads that fund investigation of these sites, because once they're gone forever.